Alright, this is our first video for Thursday, March 26th. Sorry it's a little delayed today. We're wrapping up the Period 2, Unit 2, pre-French Indian War stuff. We have a few more colonial events to cover. The last thing we talked about yesterday was Glorious Revolution, King William's War. So today I'm picking up on, let's see, I think it's PDF page 102 from the Review 1 reading packet. And we're going to be transitioning to reading 2 reading packet in a few minutes here. So we're picking up with Halfway Covenant. Excuse me. To top it all off, the Puritans fear that their religion, which they fervently believe was the only true religion, was being undermined by the growing commercialism in the cities like Boston. Many second and third generation Puritans liked the fervor of the original Pilgrim and Congregational settlers, a situation that led to the Halfway Covenant, which changed the rules governing Puritan baptisms. Prior to the passage of the Halfway Covenant in 1662, a Puritan had to experience the gift of God's grace in order for his or her children to be baptized by the church. With so many, particularly men, losing interest in the church, the Puritan clergy decided to baptize all children whose parents were baptized. However, here's the halfway part. Those who had not experienced God's grace were not allowed to vote. All these factors, religious, economic, and gender, historians argue combined to create the mass hysteria in the Salem witch trials in 1692. The hysteria ended when the accusers, most of them teenage girls, accused some of the colony's most prominent citizens of consorting with the devil, thus turning town leaders against them. Some historians also feel that the hysteria had simply run its course. As noted above, the generations that followed the original settlers were generally less religious than those that preceded them. By 1700, women constituted the majority of active church members. However, between the 1730s and 1740s, the colonies in Europe experienced a wave of religious revivalism known as the Great Awakening. Two men, Congregationalist minister Jonathan Edwards and Methodist preacher George Whitefield, came to exemplify the period. Edwards preached the severe predeterministic doctrines of Calvinism and became famous for his graphic depictions of hell. You may have read his speech, Sinners in the Hands of Your Angry God. Whitefield preached a Christianity based on emotionalism and spirituality, which today is most clearly manifested in Southern evangelism. The First Great Awakening is often described as the response of devout people to the Enlightenment, a European intellectual movement that borrowed heavily from ancient philosophy and emphasized rationalism over emotionalism or spirituality. Whitefield was a native of England, where the Enlightenment was in full swing. Its effects were also being felt in the colonies, especially in the cities. The colonists who came to typify Enlightenment ideals in America was the self-made and self-educated man Ben Franklin. Franklin was a printer's apprentice who, through his own ingenuity and hard work, became a wealthy printer and successful and respected intellectual. His Poor Richard's Almanac was extremely popular and remains influential to this day. Franklin did pioneering work in the field of electricity. He invented the bifocals, the lightning rod, and the Franklin stove, and he founded the colony's first fire department, post office, and public library. Franklin espoused Enlightenment ideals about education, government, and religion and war, and was, until Washington came along, the colony's favorite son. Toward the end of his life, he served as an ambassador in Europe, where he negotiated a crucial alliance with the French, and later the peace treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. All right, then when you've had the last little wrap up here with life in the colonies. Perhaps the most important development in the colonies during the period was the great rate of growth. The population in 1700 was 250,000. By 1750, that number was 1.25 million. Throughout these years, the colonies began to develop substantial non-English European populations. Scotch, Irish, Scots, and Germans all started arriving in large numbers during the 18th century. English settlers, of course, continued to come to the New World as well. The black population in 1750 was more than 200,000, and in few colonies, South Carolina, for example, they'd actually outnumber the whites. The vast majority of colonists, over 90%, lived in rural areas. Life for the whites in the countryside was rugged but tolerable. Labor was divided among gender lines, with men doing outdoor work like farming and women doing indoor work of housekeeping and child rearing. Opportunities for social interaction outside the family were limited to shopping days and rare special community events. Both children and women were completely subordinate to men, particularly to the head of the household, in this patriarchal society. Children's education was secondary to their work schedules. Women were not allowed to vote, own property, draft a will, or testify in court. Blacks, most of whom were slaves, lived predominantly in the countryside and in the South. Their lives varied from region to region, with conditions being most difficult in the South, where the labor was difficult and the climate less hospitable to hard work. Those slaves who worked on large plantations and developed specialized skills, such as carpentry or cooking, fared better than did field hands. In other cases, though, the condition of servitude was demeaning. Slaves often developed extended kinship ties and strong communal bonds to cope with the misery of servitude and the possibility that their mass nuclear families might be separated by sale. In the North, where black populations were relatively small, blacks often had trouble maintaining a sense of community and history. Conditions in the cities were often much worse than those in the country. Because work could often be found there, most immigrants settled in cities. The work they found generally paid too little, and poverty was widespread. Sanitary conditions were primitive, and epidemics like smallpox were common. On the positive side, cities offer residents much wider contact with other people and with the outside world. Cities served as centers for progress and education. Citizens with anything above a rudimentary level of education were rare, and nearly all colleges established during this period served primarily to train ministers. Like Harvard was a minister college. The lives of colonists in the various regions differ considerably. New England society centered on trade. Boston was the colony's major port city. The population farmed for subsistence, not for trade, and mostly subscribed to rigid Puritanism. They were also, because the region couldn't farm that much because it was very rocky. So New England colonies were like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, the areas. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, had more fertile land and so focused primarily on farming. They were known as the bread colonies due to their heavy exports of grain. Philadelphia and New York City, like Boston, were the major trade centers of the middle colonies. The population of the region was more heterogeneous than was that of New England. The lower South, the Carolinas, concentrated on such cash crops as tobacco and rice, also like Virginia. Slavery played a major role in the plantations, although the majority of Southerners were subsistence farmers who had no slaves. Blacks constituted up to half the population of some Southern colonies, like South Carolina. The colonies on the Chesapeake, Maryland, and Virginia, combined features of the middle colonies and the lower South. Slavery and tobacco played a larger role in Chesapeake than in the middle colonies, but like the middle colonies, the Chesapeake residents also farmed grain and thus diversified their economies. The development of major cities in the Chesapeake region also distinguished it from the lower South, which was almost entirely rural. Thus, the colonies were hardly a unified whole as they approached the events that led to them to rebel. So we're going to stop there. We're walking away from reading review packet 1. Now looking at reading review packet 2, the Road to Independence. So we're going up until basically the Constitution being made and the ratification of the Constitution now. Okay. This is also us officially transitioning to the different period, which is like the Unit 3 in the course guidebook. Okay. In 1754, the colonists were still considered themselves English subjects. Very few could have imagined circumstances under which they would have to leave the British Empire. The events that led to this led from almost universal loyalty to rebellion are frequently tested on the AEP exam. So basically be aware of the colonists were very happy being part of the English Empire in the 1750s until the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, broke out. All right, the Albany Plan of Union. In 1754, the representatives from 7 colonies met in Albany, New York, to consider the Albany Plan, developed by Ben Franklin. The plan provided for an intercolonial government and system of collecting taxes for the colony's defense, which sprang up as a need during the outbreak of the French Indian War. At the meeting, Franklin also tried to negotiate a treaty with the Iroquois. Franklin's efforts to unite the colonies failed to gain the approval of a single colonial legislature. The plan was rejected because the colonists did not want to relinquish their control of their right to tax themselves, nor were they prepared to unite under a single colonial government. Franklin's frustration was well publicized in one of the first American political cartoons, his drawing of a snake broken into pieces, which had the words, "Join or die." The 7 Years' War, and we'll probably do part of this and pick up the next video. Yes, the 7 Years' War lasted for 9 years, but it was called the 7 Years' War more in Europe. In the colonies, it was called the French Indian War, which is almost equally confusing because the French Indian War fought on the same French Indians fought on the same side, so it was the British versus the French Indians, not against each other. The 7 Years' War was the British name for the war. The colonists called it the French Indian War because that's who they were fighting. It was actually one of the several wars for the empire fought between the British and the French, the fourth war of 4 major wars. And Americans got stuck in the middle. This is different also because it's the first war that broke out in the colonies. As we know, the George Washington his militiamen went to do that, and it goes on to explain that here. The war was inevitable a result of colonial expansion. It was also caused by a number of inter-European power struggles, which is how Spain, Austria, Sweden, and Prussia and others got involved. As English settlers moved into the Ohio Valley, the French tried to stop them by building fortified outposts at strategic entry spots. The French were trying to protect their profitable fur trade and their control of the region. A colonial contingent led by George Washington attacked the French outposts and lost badly. Washington's surrender was allowed to return to Virginia, where he was welcomed as a hero. Other skirmishes and battles ensued, and in 1756, England officially declared war on France, which is where you get the 7 Years' War from. Most Native Americans in the region, choosing the lesser of two evils, allied themselves with the French, who had traditionally had the best relationship with the Native Americans of any of the European powers, and whom, based on Washington's performance, they had expected to win the war. The war dragged on for years before the English finally gained the upper hand. When the war was over, England was the undisputed colonial power of the continent, kicking out the French. The treaty gave England control of Canada and almost everything east of the Mississippi. The French kept only 2 sugar islands, underscoring the impact of mercantilism, since the French prioritized the 2 small islands because of all the profit they got from the trade of those 2 islands. But the rest of Louisiana went to Spain, if you recall, and basically the French didn't own any territories because Quebec had already been owned by the British by that point, so it was all British territory and Spanish territory now. So that's going to end video 1 for us.